He onore he korore ki te atua, he maungarongo ki te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Greetings to everyone. As you heard, my name is Jerry Burns. I've got various jobs. Well, I'm speaking here today partly on behalf of a broad network of Catholic social justice and development agencies called Caritas, and particularly Caritas from the South Pacific region known as Caritas Oceania. And Caritas has a particular responsibility for social justice work, social justice advocacy, development work and humanitarian relief. I've just come back from a meeting where we've been talking particularly about the famines in the Horn of Africa, the floods in Thailand and various other, and the conflict in South Sudan and Darfur. So those are some of the things that the organisation is involved in, but all of that is based on a particular concern for those most in need and the poorest and most vulnerable. And I was asked today to particularly talk on 2 points: what the churches say about wealth distribution and what are the church's views about the Occupy movement. So I'll just say a few words about the general church position. Of course, there are many churches and many different positions within the churches. I can speak a little bit about some of the what we call the mainline churches here in New Zealand, particularly Baptist, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, Salvation Army, Assemblies of God, and my own Catholic Church. Earlier this year, the leaders of those churches put out a statement on a fair society, facing the growing question of inequality in New Zealand and around the world, and basing a lot of their response to that on the book The Spirit Level, about how important it is for greater equality in all societies, how everyone is better off when things are more equal in societies, and suggesting some basic principles for establishing that here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This was issued in October, particularly in preparation for the elections. And the first principle is fair treatment of all members of society, with particular care for the most vulnerable. And that means the poorest, and particularly children in poverty. Yes. Many of you will have seen the TV program a couple of nights ago on children in poverty. I work a lot in the Porirua Basin area. Those situations described there are very familiar to me. Last night I was with a migrant woman who works as a domestic servant, basically. Her difficulties with employment, with health and with sufficient income. All those problems are very clear to me. The growing disparity between rich and poor here. Some people say that that gap has slowed down or stopped in the last little while. I don't believe it. Technically maybe that's so in terms of the figures that are available, but I'm sure, and certainly over the last couple of years with the kind of changes to the tax system, the economic recession, I'm sure that gap is continuing to grow. And it's harder and harder to cross that gap. It's very clear to me, and it's also very clear to me that the system that we live under, the economic system that we live under, is creating and exacerbating that, and it needs radical change. That said, between the lines in this statement, we need to say it more clearly, and we need to start looking at ways in which we can have policies that bridge that gap, have a radically different kind of economic system that looks after the earth and looks after the people on the earth, especially those who are suffering, bearing the brunt of that system. I've also worked in South America and Peru for 8 years. I've seen that system at its most brazen with the economic restructuring and the shock tactics because of the foreign debts of those countries, particularly Peru in the 90s. I've worked in areas of the world where poverty and exclusion has been created by war. I've seen those kind of things. Here it's happening, if you like, more subtly but just as clearly, and by deliberate government policy and by the interests of the powerful. All those things need to be challenged. And the basis for that, churches take different bases. My own church has a particular group of principles called Catholic social teaching, but they're all based on the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament. In the Old Testament, people like the writer of Exodus portrays a God who hears the suffering and sees the suffering of his people in Egypt. He sees that they're being manipulated in their workplace. He sees the genocidal tactics, people being made to work harder, and the population control policies put in place to kill off the Hebrew people at that stage. He says, I see and I hear this thing and I want to do something about it. You have the prophet Isaiah talking on behalf of God, observing what was happening in the Israel of his day, watching the oppression of the people. He says, you oppress your workmen on your fast days, you strike the poor man with your fist. This is not the kind of behaviour that pleases me. It is God who speaks. Share your bread with the hungry, shelter the homeless poor, clothe the one you see to be naked, do not turn from your own kin. And everyone in this world is a member of our family. If you do away with the yoke, the clenched fist, the wicked word, if you give your bread to the hungry and relief to the oppressed, then your light will shine in the darkness. And Jesus was a prophet who stood in that line. He said to the rich young man, go and sell all you have and give it to the poor. He got the 5,000 people to sit down and share their 5 loaves and 2 fish, and they fed 5,000 people from that smallness. The basic message is that if we share what we have, and we have to find the policies today to do this, there's enough wealth in the world for everyone, there's enough food in the world for everyone. The problem is distribution, and the problem is economic systems and poverty. Jesus put himself and spoke for those, alongside those in need, spoke for them, and that's why he was put to death. That's the political reason why he was put to death. He was too dangerous. So he stands for a different kind of economic system. He preached it as the kingdom of God, when the oppression and the injustice of his time at all times would be overturned. Sometimes today it's put in another way. Another world is possible. There's another way of talking about that. So I see my church, the central core teaching of my church, as backing that system. We don't always live up to it. Many of our people share oppressors in that system, but I think the core teaching of our church and the Christian churches is around that message. So in that sense, I think the churches, certainly my own church, my own organisations, are right behind the presence of the Occupy movement. Not necessarily tactics are another question, but the establishment of the Occupy movement as a call to the conscience of cities, of communities, of governments around the world, especially in the developed world, is absolutely vital. So I come here to say thank you for those of you involved in that system. We have to keep working on how we change that system, how we produce ways to do away with poverty, to abolish it, to have a more just and fair society. But the core of it is getting people to recognise the problem and saying we have to do something about it. So thank you to those involved in the Occupy movement. Thank you for being this conscience. Thank you for being this reminder. And from my point of view, you're doing God's work. Kia ora tātou. Kia ora.